Absolutely, thank you. Tonight, we bring before the board a presentation to give you information on some of the possibilities with the remaining $77 million that we have, and also a report on some of the status of Mount Diablo Unified. So I would like to introduce Dale Scott, and he will then introduce his team. Thank you.
Let me start by introducing also Mark Farrell, who's in the audience. Mark works in our Los Angeles office. Mark brings a great deal of experience. He used to be with Piper Jaffray as an underwriter and investment banker, has been working with us. So he brings a lot of real life experience as we start talking about how these transactions get put together in the market and what the interest rates are. He also has served for many years as the advisor to the California School Boards Association on their short-term TRAN program, a program that we now serve as financial advisor. What I thought we'd do tonight, to kind of give you the lineup, is first of all, I want to keep it as casual as possible, so there's back and forth questions instead of us sitting up here and talking. I thought we would talk about where you've been and how did you get here, almost in a sort of forensic way. And I apologize that gets a little data heavy, but I want to make sure you understand all of the pieces that we see about how you got where you are today. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to talk about options for what you do next. And then I'm going to come back and we'll talk about options for what you do going forward and then in the long-term future. On that note, even though I know it seems like a distant possibility, I just want to put it out there that most large districts in the state have multiple bond elections over time. And that's just, if you look around, Stockton Unified's had 3-4 elections. Current high school districts had 2 or 3 elections. They're talking about another one. Eastside Union High School District in San Jose has had 5 or 6 elections, I think, and they're talking about another one. So that's just sort of, when you're going to do larger districts, that's pretty much the format. They're constantly thinking about what's the next thing that we're going to need to do because the needs are so enormous. So when we're putting these transactions together, we're trying to keep our eye both on the ball of what's best for the taxpayers at the time, but also what are the things that can come back to haunt us as we're going to the next election, whenever that may be. And the 2 biggest issues in my mind that we try to keep our eye on are the tax rate that was originally not promised, but originally announced to voters, number 1, and number 2, the project list. Were the projects brought in, the projects that were discussed, the projects that which were underlined, were they brought in on time and on budget? So we'll talk about both of those pieces in the context of how that affects ongoing needs of the district. So with that, if I can figure this out, let's go to page 3. This is simply background, make sure everybody's on the same page. Obviously, we come at this new. We don't have any of this information, so everything we're looking at is brand new to us. So it took me a while to kind of get my arms around it. The 2010 bond authorization, $348 million. Obviously, you have $77 million remaining. That's the red portion. Here's the copy of the actual ballot language that was given. A Prop 39 election, a tax rate of $40, a tax rate extension of $60, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go to the next page. Proposition C, it's C, right? Proposition C was presented to voters as a no tax increase bond measure or a tax rate extension. Now that's changed, but these are the documents that were given to voters, and this was in the sample ballot. A note from the county council in his or her partial analysis: the district estimates that the combined tax rate for these bonds and the district's Measure C bonds approved by voters on March 5th will be no higher than $60 per $100,000 of assessed farther down into the sample ballot, a statement from the then president of the board, your board. The combined annual tax rate for these bonds and the district's Measure C bonds is expected to be no higher than $60 per $100,000 of assessed valuation. The combined of the two. Okay, let's put that to the side for a second. We'll come back to that. On the next page, page 5, you see the assessed valuation. Now, I know you've been through this a little bit, but the reason we have to focus on assessed valuation is because that's going to affect what happens to tax rates, obviously. You can see that back in, starting in 03, up to 07, 08, you guys were going gangbusters. 6%, 9%, 10%. And then you had the drop-off, which started in 2010. And now the last couple of years, you've come back. But over time, the average rate has been about 3%. About 3%. Now, hopefully it'll go faster than that, higher than that. Hopefully it won't, it'll be less than that. But we still have to pick some number that underlies this analysis. It has to be conservative, it has to be, everybody has to kind of buy into it, with the expectation that it probably won't be exactly correct. But that all of the financings, all of the analyses that are within this assume an ongoing assessed valuation increase of 3% per year. That's the base. On page 6, and I think this is interesting. You know, we talk about, and you look back on that page 5, and wow, you had 2 enormous increases in the last 2 years on a percentage basis. But if you turn to page 6, you can see that this was the first year, in terms of absolutes, that you are back to where, ahead of where you were in 2009. Assessed valuation in 2009 was $32.8 billion, and you just passed that mark. So that has taken, what, 7 years to get that back. So the kinds of increases you've had are great, but they've had a real impact on where you stand today, because you've really not, you really haven't moved off the dime from where you were when you passed the election in terms of assessed valuation. Now going forward, we're going to assume 3%. Okay, page 7. Page 7, and all of these slides are set up the same way, until Mark takes over and changes a little bit. But they're set up so that you see both the debt service and the projected tax rates. Debt service, when I say debt service, I mean the repayment of principal and interest, and that doesn't change. It doesn't matter if your assessed valuation goes up 20%, your assessed valuation goes down 20%, it doesn't matter. These are the actual absolute dollars that have to be paid back by taxpayers on the left. On the right is if we take those numbers, and again, we apply the 3% assessed valuation assumption, that is then the tax rate that the county assessor would have to impose in order to collect that much money based on assessed valuation. So you can see these are the rates going forward, assumed rates, projected rates, on the 2002 election from 2015 out to 2030, 31. Okay, page 8. Now we get into the 2010 election. And remember, we started out saying this was going to be no tax rate increase. And I think this is really, to me, this is one of the seminal slides here. So here we are. These bonds were sold, I think, about 3 months after the election. It wasn't like, a couple of years went by. This series was sold right away. It was in the amount of about $110 million. So less than a third of the bonds had been sold. And you can see on the tax rate combined, 2002 and 2010, you were at that moment, remember, because the assessed valuation hasn't changed between, we're now back where we were in 2010. So at that moment, you were at $60 combined. My point is, there's no way you could have gone forward on this without issuing a very large amount of capital appreciation bonds and maintained that $60 tax rate pledge, if you will.